A very warm welcome to everybody this evening for, I think it's the 7th book briefing for December. And as you'll have seen from my announcement, the 3 books I'm going to be looking at are the Tao Te Ching edition by Shantina Sabatini, then Sensitive Soul by Michael, and then another Michael, Mikhail Gorbachev, his new book, What is at Stake Now? So they're very different books. They're covering quite a different range of material. So I'll start with the Tao Te Ching. Some of you may have attended the weekend that we organized with Shantina and his wife, Cruz, in October. And that was, for me, that shed a lot of light on how the Chinese mind works, or used to work before it was westernized, and how we need to make our own understanding a bit more subtle and less binary than it actually is. And he's got a huge version of the I Ching, which some of you may have bought. And this version of the Tao Te Ching, which you can order on Amazon, is 630 pages. So that gives you an idea of its extent. And so I'm going to read and comment on a few of the points he makes in his introduction. So he writes that the Tao starts where Wittgenstein leaves off. And Wittgenstein famously said, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent." And the Tao Te Ching takes off from there. And he starts by looking at what the Tao actually means. And I'll just read this out because it gives you an idea of the number of resonances and connotations. Way, road, path, lead, connect, course, conduit, way to be followed, guiding principle, norm, doctrine, follow a doctrine, be adept of, the Tao, the way, art, method, magical or technical work, power of the diviner, magician or king, rule, govern, discourse, say, teach, speak, explain, express, communicate, know, realize. So you can immediately see that there's a lot of what he calls resonance of meaning, and in the connotations that are put out there. And then if you take the first verse, which is commonly translated as, let me just find the right place right at the beginning, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. And he then goes on to say that the possible readings of this verse are a way that can be spoken / taught / communicated is not a constant eternal way. A norm or doctrine that can be spoken, taught, or communicated is not a constant eternal norm or doctrine. A discourse or teaching that can be spoken, taught, communicated is not a constant eternal discourse or teaching. And then all guidance that can be spoken / taught, communicated is not constant eternal guidance. And it puts me in mind of a story with Glenn Schaefer, who was a professor of ecological physics, and he used to speak at the Mystics and Scientists Conference a number of times. And we had a day with him where he talked for a few minutes about the Tao. And he said, "He who knows does not speak, he who speaks does not know." And then he paused and realized what he'd said, and the fact that he'd been speaking for about 4 hours by then. And it was a moment of self-reflection, a rather delightful moment of self-reflection. So I won't read you any more translations, but if you go to where that is translated in more detail, he'll then give various other translations, about 5 or 6 of them. And then at a slightly later stage, you'll see, if I show you this, that he does a verbatim translation using the actual symbols so that you can understand what the symbols themselves represent. then what's very interesting is, as you'll maybe realize, that his background is as a quantum physicist. And when it comes to the ambiguity or paradox, he uses the Magritte pipe. This is not a pipe, as a kind of allegory for what one might say from a quantum physics point of view. And then he goes and makes some comparisons between the two. But the point that one needs to retain, I think, from a Western angle, is that no meaning excludes any other. And so you can't get the meaning of something. You can only get resonances of meaning, which makes the whole process quite subtle. Then if we go on to the section on the Lao Tzu and physics, he talks a little bit about the nature of observation as a creative act, since through it some previously undefined property of the observed system takes a definite value. And so he draws a comparison here with a superposition of states. But the more states you superimpose on each other, you still don't get to a state that is completely final and stable. So everything in that respect is provisional. And then, yes, that's that point I've just made. And then going on to the last page, he says that seeking the solution at a more fundamental level means questioning the philosophical premises implicit in the formulation of the problem. And this is something that we are doing in the Galileo Commission, so far as the philosophy of science is concerned, because there's no such thing as a God's eye view. We all have a perspective which is informed by our training, our thinking, our habits, our reading, and so on. And so you can see there's an inevitable limitation of experience in the world, and also from the very nature of being embodied. And so he suggests that the elementary core of the experience of the world is a process in which consciousness and world, mind and matter, subject and object co-emerge from the undifferentiated non-dual background of existence. So I think you sort of get the point, and you can see how this relates to David Bohm's idea of the implicate order of a unified dynamic state out of which the explicate order emerges, this undifferentiated background. So all of this is very subtle. And I wanted just to refer briefly to this book by Emilios Buratinos. This is a book prize for 2018, Science, Objectivity and Consciousness. And if you haven't read it and you're interested in consciousness, then this should be very high on your reading list. I reviewed it in the December issue 2018. And he's talking about fuzzy logic, and he refers to Chinese fuzziness. And he said, in old China, nothing was considered purely one thing or another, subject or object. Chinese logic was fuzzy par excellence. People didn't focus on unchanging states. They focused on changing patterns and the regularities these manifest. And I think this is absolutely critical, that this changing patterns. So the book of changes, the I Ching is the book of changes. And whereas we do the opposite, we focus on abstracted states and nouns, and without paying so much attention to verbs. And that's an inheritance of Aristotelian binary logic. And so he says here, the crucial question is whether scientists allow the what of their personal beliefs to spill over into the how of nature, or on the contrary, they invite the how of nature to spill over into the what of their personal beliefs. And so you can see what he's driving at here, that if we dynamically appreciate these processes in nature, then we can we probably get a better and more dynamic idea of it. I've just realized I didn't put the microphone on, but it'll still be picking everything up. So that's the first book. So anybody got any comments or questions they'd like to ask? I don't think Shantina was hoping to be on the call, but he's not. So we can't consult him, which is a pity. So just put your hand up if you'd like to say something. I think you all know how to put your hand up now after all these Zoom calls that we've done.
Så nu kan du räcka upp handen, nu syns du. Det är du som ska räcka upp handen.
Jens, would you like to say something? Can't see your hand, but let me see if I can unmute you. Can you unmute yourself?
I'm trying. Have I succeeded? Hello? I'm unmuted, I think.
Oh, wait a minute. Yes, you are. You should be unmuted.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, I can't. Why can't I hear you? Let me just try my my settings. There's something, my preferences. There's something wrong here. Audio.
We can hear him, David.
Same as system. Here we go. Try now. Try. Yes, good.
Yes, can you hear me now?
I can. I had obviously some audio things which I don't have. So yeah.
I have a very simple question. What is the relation between this book, which seems to be on Taoism, and I Ching, Tao Te Ching to I Ching? Is there any relation, or?
Well, a lot of the same. I mean, what the relation? Part of the answer to that question is that both of these editions came out of an Eranos cooperation with Rudolf Ritzmer, and they are both classics of Chinese philosophy. But one is specifically a classic of Taoism, the classic of Taoism. And the other one, emerged out of a different lineage, which also includes the Confucian element. And it really gained prominence in the West after the edition with C.G. Jung. And so this is a more recent edition, which has a lot of sort of supplementary material in it.
So this is the classic by Lao Tzu?
Yes, it is. Yeah, absolutely. Which I'm sure you have in your extensive...
I do.
If not various versions of it.
Yeah, maybe even that. Yes.
Yeah. Patrick, you seem to be unmuted. Did you want to say something?
Just briefly, just to chime in, I'm just curious to see whether people are kind of cognizant, aware of just, what's called within developmental psychology a construct-aware level of adult development. And I mean, it chimes very, very kind of much with what we're talking about. And it is this kind of awareness, that comes around in terms of actually kind of just a sense of the constructedness of our environment. And then, of course, the constructedness of the self. And when that is practiced, if you like, and it becomes a, relative constant, it tends to kind of lend itself to a sense of flow, sense of connection, a sense of, of a recognition, if you like, of the, transience of the experience that we're having now, and that the sense of, if you like, I don't know, flow and continuity from that. It's an empirical stage of adult development. I suppose it's deemed to be quite, mature. But we have a lot of evidence, for people who are operating at that, stage. And I think it's interesting in terms of actually kind of when people become cognizant that is available, if you like, that it kind of has a sense of affirming people's sense and experience, that many others are having this as well, and that it's empirically grounded. So yeah, just to throw that in the mix.
Yes, I think that's interesting with respect to the use of the word flow, because the flow state is a kind of metaphor, and there's a lot about water and the power of water and the flow and going with the flow in terms of your action. This is Wu Wei. And so and that's certainly something we strive for, I think, or maybe we shouldn't strive for it. We should allow it to arise.
Yeah, there's all the paradoxes
Yes.
there. Yes.
If you try too hard, it's like a sport.
Yeah.
The harder you try, the less well you play, or the more nervous you are about your putting, the worse it goes.
But you know when you're in it.
You do. You do.
Mm.
I've even had that experience on the golf course once or twice.
There we go. Yeah, there's Golf in the Kingdom is a great book by
yes, no,
Michael.
I know
yes,
that.
yes,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yes, so I think the other thing that occurred to me is going back. Some of you will have been on the Keith Ward call last night when he was talking about the Hegel and contextualization, and it struck me that again is something that one needs to be cognizant of, what one's tradition is, how a language is structured, how thinking is structured, how God and religion are structured, because you can only respond within, at least initially, within that framework. Anyone else like to make a point? We've got a couple of minutes before moving. Richard, I can see your hand because you happen to be on my screen. You need to unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah. Now, I don't yet know much about it, but Whitehead's process philosophy.
Ah, yes.
Would this then match in some way or correlate with the Chinese idea of the Tao, that the thing is process rather than substance, do you think?
That's an very interesting point, because I've never read any reference in Whitehead to Chinese thought and the Tao, but that may be because I just haven't read enough. Although I actually have read Process and Reality. There can't be very many people who've read it. It's 1983 in Germany. I read it. And I've been rereading Science in the Modern World, which are lectures he gave in Cambridge in the 1920s. And also, I've got on the stocks a book on rethinking consciousness, which is from a Whitehead viewpoint, and I'm halfway through that at the moment. And then David Ray Griffin, whose books I review regularly, he talks a lot about well, he's a pan-experientialist, which is what Whitehead's expression for pan-psychism, but starting from experience rather than the pan-psyche. So I think that's a very interesting question, but certainly a process rather than the substance metaphysic would by definition be closer to the Chinese idea. Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm just going to see if I can move my camera up slightly. Yeah, that's better. Good. Well, let's go on to the next book, which is called Sensitive Soul, and I've written a review of it, the unseen role of emotion in extraordinary states. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read my review and comment on it, and then we'll open up for some questions. So this is a review which is coming up in the next issue. I'll just adjust this thing to a more stable place. Good. Subtitled "The Unseen Role of Emotion in Extraordinary States," this fascinating book is an exploration of the fields through a new lens based on the observation that emotion exists within and between people, underpins personality, spirituality, and a range of extraordinary perceptions, conditions, and experiences. We exist in a flowing, interconnected empathosphere. That's a word I hadn't come across before, but I think it's rather a good one. And some of us have thinner boundaries than others, which can also come about as a result of trauma, psychic and mystical experiences, as many near-death experiencers have reported. Thick boundary or thick-skinned people are rigid, calm, deliberate, well-organized, and persevering. That's a quote. While thin boundary people are open, vulnerable, reactive, flexible, and agitated. In other words, more sensitive. The book considers a range of phenomena at the intersection between mind, body, and emotion, beginning with PTSD and moving on to mirror senses and various forms of extraordinary perception. The author argues that 5 types of people, individuals with autism, synesthesia, savantism, child prodigies, and children who remember previous lives, are linked through the biology of emotion, which is associated with a hidden emotional intensity and also with electrical sensitivity. And he cites many fascinating case histories. And this put me in mind of some of the work done by a member called Michael Shallis, who used to teach in the External Studies Department at Oxford. And he studied electrosensitive people and also people who had effects on electricity. So the most extreme of which, and I read this as a result of somebody having a near-death experience, is that somebody would walk down the road during the day and the street lights would go on. And what the mechanism of that is, I can't quite imagine. Anyway, I'll just continue. One should note that the very etymology of telepathy means to feel at a distance, telepathos. This was coined by Frederick Myers, with its bodily equivalent of telesomatic, that's soma, so feelings, bodily sensations at a distance, where closely bonded people are able to feel the bodily sensations of their loved ones at a distance. And there might be, let me just check if there's an example of this, because I've got quite a lot of examples in extraordinary communication of distress. So here, I'll just give you a couple of these examples so you get the idea. A mother was writing a letter to her daughter when her right hand felt as though it was burning and she dropped the pen. Less than an hour later, she received a phone call relating that her daughter's right hand had been severely burned by acid in a laboratory accident. A man felt himself choking inexplicably, only to learn that his father had been choking at the same time thousands of miles away. And then another one, the man and his wife were attending a football game when the man got up and announced they had to return home because their son had been hurt. Once home, they discovered the boy had shot a BB into his thumb, which would require emergency surgery. So here's another one. The soldier was knocked unconscious by shell fragments. That same day, a continent away, his daughter, aged 2.5, was playing on the family's kitchen floor. According to the man's wife, their toddler suddenly got up and said to her mother, "Daddy's been hurt," then went back to her toys. So, and what Rupert Sheldrake would suggest that this is due to morphic resonance. And he's found that his telepathy experiments work better with people who are closely bonded. They might get a 40% rate, a 40+% rate, hit rate, and with his telephone and text telepathy, where people who don't know each other are nearer the chance level of 25%, which is 1 in 4, because there are 4 possibilities. So I call this empathetic resonance, this capacity that we have to feel something at a distance. And I reply this in my book, Hole in One, which is now called Resonant Mind, to the life review, the near-death experience and post-mortem life review. And so it's not something that he had heard of, so it's not referenced, but I've sent him my book. So some cases are even more extraordinary, where verbal abuse can be translated into bruises integrated from a prior physical abuse. So listen to this. A still more unfortunate woman was regularly beaten by her husband. As their sons grew up, they kept the father from physically beating their mother. He then began to attack her with words. Whenever he unleashed a barrage of verbal abuse, bruises and black and blue marks would appear on her skin in the very places where she had previously received bruises from her husband's beatings. The psychiatrist watched the bruises appear on the woman's arms when she talked about verbal abuse. Quite amazing. This is a bit like the stigmata effect. And then another case shows that a woman with multiple personality disorder had been abused by her father, but only one personality knew about the abuse. So whenever this personality emerged, burn marks would appear on the woman's arms. Once she shifted from that personality, the burn marks would go away. I think you'll agree, these are extraordinarily interesting and I think significant experiences. Then the author argues that highly attuned sensing, and that's in quotes, is in fact our default setting that is subsequently overlaid by cultural factors and overall development. Those who retain this faculty are most likely to experience anomalous perceptions, which will in turn influence our sense of self. Sometimes these extraordinary capacities appear after a brain injury, providing further backup for a filter theory of mind and the existence of a universal mind postulated by early researchers such as Thomas J. Hudson and leading New Thought thinkers from the late 19th century. A note, I have mentioned Thomas J. Hudson on a couple of occasions recently, and he published an extensive book in 1890 called The Law of Psychic Phenomena. And I reviewed it a number of years ago, but I can't actually find the review. I was looking for it quite recently. But the significance of that book was its discussion of hypnosis, which was in its early stages, because apparently there were two schools of hypnosis and study of those kind of altered states or different states. One of them was in Paris, which was Charcot, and Charcot was the mentor to Freud. And they were quite reductionist and dismissive about any kind of relationship of these capacities, savantism, for instance, as well, to psychic experience and the idea of a universal mind. But there was another group working in Nancy in eastern France who took this opposite view that we should try to understand something more about the superconscious mind, if you like, or universal mind, and work out how this might shed some light on these capacities. Because another example of this was a book I reviewed on near-death experiences in the last issue, where after this terrible accident on a railway, this man started painting pictures and also composing music, and he had no musical experience at all other than strumming around on a guitar. I also find that the universal mind idea more coherent than fashionable genetic memory as an explanatory hypothesis, but that's something obviously is open to discussion. And the same logic applies to other forms of prodigy and extraordinary knowing. And then he weaves in bodily factors on the basis of other scientific research. And that's my last paragraph here. Interestingly, he argues in a previous book that thin boundary people are more likely to report anomalous perceptions, whereas thick boundary people are more likely to engender anomalies. I don't know whether you remember from Jung's Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, he describes an incident with Freud where there's a lot of tension in the room, and he says there's going to be a catalytic exteriorization phenomenon of a sharp report coming out of the bookcase. And as soon as he said it, a sharp report comes out of the bookcase. And Freud is really quite disturbed by this. And Jung tells him it's going to happen again. And it does. And so this is really a key, significant, symbolic incident, I think. And I think there's probably an argument that in that sense, Freud was thicker skinned than Jung. And so I talk about that. And then I say here, the distinction between thin and thick also seems to correspond to the tender and tough-minded classification of William James, where the latter is correlated with hard, for which read masculine, science. This difference of temperament could go some way towards explaining the debate about the status of psi. The theory also sheds light on why particular children remember previous lives, when one notes that a higher proportion than normal of the lives remembered entailed violent deaths. So in Ian Stevenson's research database, about 40%. The author connects the endurance of emotion with birthmarks and remembered lives, as well as heart transplants. And here he doesn't refer to the possibility of attachment playing a role, or some form of discarnate intelligence, which Alan Sanders and Andrew Powell have done a lot of work on, or some kind of akashic memory field. And so that's a blank there. And then I conclude by saying this pioneering book makes a strong case for emotion as fundamental to sentient life, including animals and plants, and helps expand the discussion of the nature of consciousness beyond cognition and in the direction of panpsychism. So that's that book, Sentient Sensitive Soul. And I'm arranging a webinar with Mike for June. I think I've given him June the 16th, which is the first available date, because we're planned up until that point. Anybody like to make a comment on that book? Oh, how interesting. In times of great emotional distress, I've set fire alarms off. This is Ghislaine. And so, yes, that's very interesting. Ghislaine, did you want to speak? You've got your microphone.
Yeah, it was very strange. The first time was when I was actually I was studying hypnosis, and I was under hypnosis myself, but thought that I wasn't. Thought I had complete control. And when the student therapist touched on a subject which was very profound for me, I unexpectedly erupted in a burst of sobs. And we were on the 8th floor of the medical school in Leeds. And immediately after I sobbed, within a nanosecond, the fire alarm went off and we had to evacuate the building, and clearly there was no fire. And then the only time I understood that kind of retrospectively was then some years later, my mother died. And my husband, it was actually, who noticed that when we went to bed in the evenings and I was clearly distressed, the fire alarm downstairs kept several nights on, would go off unexpectedly. And then I realized, a bit like Jung, that synchronicity of events, but it was linked to great emotion. So it's just interesting what you were talking about there.
Very interesting. I mean, it's a form of sort of macro PK in a way. I mean, if you're going to make a causal link, which I think there is certainly an argument for doing, because I suppose it's not dissimilar. What I don't know is people switching on lamp posts as they walk past, whether there's any emotion involved in that or not. That would be interesting. Steve, I think you wanted to speak.
Okay, a couple of comments. One, I do know of people over the years who do have that, but they walk past things like a fridge and it starts vibrating and things. And a few of my friends, I refer them as ultra sensitive rather than just sensitive. I mean, we're all sensitive to less than great degree. And another comment about sometimes some of these things, what people have these things, something can trigger it, something in their life, and sometimes it can get stuck. And then it needs to resolve somehow, because it's, as in the last comment, it needs to flow rather than, it's like an imprint, but it doesn't need to, it's not permanent, it's just gets a bit caught in, maybe in the aura of the individual. Again, this is beyond our everyday thinking. And I think the other comment I'd like to say is in training for mediumistic communication for proving survival of bodily death, some of the training is sometimes mediums learn when they link into the deceased loved one, they sometimes get information about how the person passed, and then they can get an experience of the person, say, really bad heart or horrible taste or really
Oh, yes.
something, and it's like it's just a memory link to give them more evidence to prove what the person passed of, so that's to give it more evidence sort of thing, and then they ask it to be taken away because they don't want to own it, so they can carry on with the communication. Anyway, that was just
No, that's interesting. So it's kind of getting on the emotional vibration level, as it were.
It's the emotion. It's like because it's, well, yeah, emotions. It's because even, in our physical, mental, emotional, all these different layers, and I look at it holistically, they're all going on at all different, like, frequencies, vibrations. Anyway,
Yes, no, I think that's very interesting, and certainly there's a lot of documented cases of this telesomatic phenomenon. I remember one. I was going to do a short program, BBC Manchester. So I was in a taxi on the way from the airport, and the taxi driver always asked, "We're going to BBC. What are you doing?" So I explained what I was doing. He said, "Oh, I'm a twin," and so this is always happening to me, with my twin brother. And he gave the example that they'd gone off for the weekend to spend, in their caravans together, and his brother had decided to come back on Saturday evening or Saturday afternoon, and about 11 o'clock on Saturday night, this taxi driver was already in bed, and he had a sensation of falling. And he just couldn't understand it because he was quite safely in his bed in his caravan, and he rang his brother up the next morning and said, "Are you okay?" He said, "No, well, not really, because I had a few too many beers last night and I fell down the stairs." At that same time that he had felt this, and so I find this quite fascinating. It's very well attested. The hundreds of cases, and so the interesting thing to discuss is in pathosphere idea. How does it happen? What is the actual, quote, mechanism, unquote, for this effectively transfer of sensation? So it's feeling something at a distance, and I don't know the answer to that. I mean, Rupert would say it's morphic resonance, but I don't know whether that's sufficiently precisely defined. But it must be something. It must be something vibrational in a general sense. So this would be a very interesting research project. If people, serious scientists had a look at this and came up with some theories, and then tried to. I don't know how you test it, because a lot of it is field work. I mean, you can. The one, Peter Fenwick, he once did some experiments with evoked potential, which have been initiated by Jacobo Grinberg-Zilberbaum, and so you have two people in a Faraday cage, and you stimulate the brain, and they know each other very well. They're bonded. You stimulate the brain of the first one, and you get an evoked potential at the same time in the brain of the second, but not if they don't know each other. In other words, the emotional bonding is a precondition for this evoked potential in the second person. Jolly interesting. Geraldine, you want to share something? Then we'll move on to Gorbachev. Just unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted.
You are.
I have been taking Bash flower remedies for many years, and at the moment I was taking a few. I went to pick up the bottles, and the word vervain flashed into my mind. Now, I've taken this particular remedy before, so I went to the shop and I thought I must buy it and find out what it's about. Now, my recent complete dedication is to persuade people not to use Amazon.com. I am so addicted to persuading people not to use it. And I think I'm getting over the top. And that is what the vein is for. The vein is overcommitment to a cause.
Oh, interesting.
That is just, I just thought I'd share this because nothing quite like this has ever happened to me. And later in the day, I was doing some work with somebody and I realized that I had to rein in my powers of trying to persuade everyone not to use Amazon.
Okay.
And I would
well,
like to take this opportunity to say, don't use Amazon. It's evil.
No, I thought you might. Yeah, you certainly an opportunity to make that point, and I've thought about it myself. And the Hive apparently is the place you can go for books, HIVE, if you look at it.
Lots
Anyway,
of
thank you
places.
for that. And I'm going to go on to this third book, Mikhail Gorbachev, What is at Stake Now? And this is a remarkable statement, I think. I mean, obviously, Gorbachev qualifies for the title elder statesman. And when I was thinking about this on my walk this afternoon, I thought, well, there are two components there. There's the elder component, where you ask for wise advice, or you expect to hear wise advice. And then there is the statesman component, to somebody who has extensive political experience. And it put me in mind of the last book I did, or one of the books at my last briefing, which was Sir David Attenborough, A Life on Our Planet. And he said, he calls this book his witness statement. And it struck me that this is Gorbachev's witness statement, an appeal for peace and freedom. And both of them say that our situation, whether militarily, politically, economically, or ecologically, is unsustainable, and therefore large changes have to come about. So he writes from both a global viewpoint, but also from as a Russian, as you would expect. And one of the things he talks about in terms of the militarization is the idea that we can actually use force and violence as a routine way of solving our problems, and I'll come back to this, that the US has tended to take a unipolar view, dominating view, instead of a multipolar partnership view, which would correspond to this partnerism that we had Riane Eisler talking about back in July. And I want to read you something from another book, which was written by Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger is what they call a realist in terms of his policy. And he wrote this in the 1970s, and he's 94, 95 now, and still hugely influential. 6 essential principles of international politics. 1, a great power must have a grand long-term global foreign policy which maximizes its interests in the world. 2, in pursuit of such a policy, it must maintain sufficient economic and military power to defeat at least 2 of its rivals at any one time. 3, a great power must promote regional rivalries and conflicts, note, thereby always maintaining a key balancing role globally. Think China, Taiwan, India, Pakistan, Israel, Palestine. 4, democracies are not effective at the conduct of foreign policy. Therefore, information must be managed and true strategic interests hidden. And in the US, we have in other countries as well, we have the government, and then we have the intelligence service, which are often doing opposite things. Then 5, a great power must occasionally use its power overtly, otherwise the threat of force is not credible. Very familiar argument. And he said the US involvement in military campaigns since the Second World War is legion, and he gives examples. 6, war needs to be seen not only as a natural extension of state power, but as an activity essential to the survival of the state, as articulated by the report from Iron Mountain in the late 1960s. So this is a view that power is what it's all about. National interest, power, and unipolar, and what the Pentagon calls full spectrum dominance. Now, Gorbachev advocates the elimination of nuclear weapons. Because of COVID and the environmental crisis, we seem to have taken our eye off the ball of nuclear weapons, and he brings this firmly back onto the agenda, and says that we really should, as a species, and I can't but agree with him, get to the point where these are just abolished and nobody spends any more money researching them. But what we've got instead is the development of tactical nuclear weapons, small scale. And in my view, such weapons were used in Iraq with the depleted uranium. That was actually a nuclear weapon, in my view, but that's a few years ago. And he says, I hadn't heard of the Charter of Paris, which was signed in 1990, founded on respect and cooperation and the strengthening of democracy and shared values. So a steadfast commitment to democracy based on human rights and fundamental freedoms, prosperity through economic liberty and social justice, and these are two things that need to be balanced, and equal security for all our countries. So he makes this point that security is in fact now mutual. You can't increase your security by diminishing the security of another power. And so this should be obvious, but it doesn't seem to be in the kind of political jockeying. Then he goes on to talk about globalization in the next part, and a theme that runs through the whole book is trust and loss of trust, and how one regains trust having lost it. And so this is obviously key. And it put me in mind that yesterday afternoon I was reviewing the most recent book on David Bohm's dialogue technique. And this is a technique of listening and respect and responding without taking a fixed position that we badly need in the world now. So this was equal security for all, and this involves also the renunciation of first strike, which hasn't happened. Then he goes on to reinforce this idea that we must act together, and then he goes on to globalization. Let me just see. I've got these things quite difficult to read, and so he discusses who's benefited from globalization, and he's critical, as you can imagine, of neoliberal Washington consensus free market, in which the state relinquishes many of its obligations as towards its citizens, and we have a situation of competition, deregulation, and privatization, which is the privatization of profit and the socialization of loss, he writes. And he says that the state shouldn't be regarded just as a bureaucratic organization. And he feels that the new model has to be based on a combination of market-based and private initiatives, the principles of corporate, social, and environmental responsibility, and effective state regulation. So it's really a question of getting the balance right. But and then we'll come on to populism in a moment. Then he goes on to the environmental challenge, and his main suggestion there is that we should look at properly implementing the Earth Charter. And I don't know how many of you have read the Earth Charter or seen it. I read it a number of years ago, but it's really summed up in to save humanity and all future generations of people, we must save the Earth. And it's set out in extremely rigorous legal terms and framework, So respect for the care and care for the community of life, ecological integrity, social and economic justice, democracy, non-violence, and peace. So these are the sorts of ideas that if we took them seriously and prioritized their implementation, we'd go a long way towards resolving some of the challenges that we have. Then he looks at development of technologies, and then makes the point that responsibility and a precautionary approach should be adopted, and that people in general should be engaged in looking at the ethical implications of different forms of technology. Then I thought it was interesting that in the Forum of Nobel Peace Prize winners, that in 2005, they talk about focusing on meeting human needs and having a reverence for life are the foundation of human security. This reverence for life is a phrase that comes from Albert Schweitzer. And he suggests as a starter to redirect military into educational and environmental initiatives by everybody reducing their military budgets by 10 to 15%. Though one can't see that happening in the immediate term. And then he goes on to talk about the wave of populism and the decline of democracy. And again, one comes back to this whole question of trust and expectation, and the fact that these democracy and freedom, from the Eastern European and EU point of view, were meant to solve a lot of problems, but they didn't deliver in a way that that included everyone. Therefore, people felt they were left out, and they're then more likely to go for some populist view. And then his next chapter is on politics and morals. Can they be reconciled? Good question. And one of the things he talks about is cynicism, because politicians put forward programs they know they can't really fulfill, and then people feel let down when they can't fulfill them, and then that leads to a spiral of distrust going downwards. And I think it's a difficult one, this, because elections are competitive. You have to make promises better than and more effective than your competitors, and yet at the same time, if you over promise and under deliver, then your future is not going to be a rosy one. And then in pages 65 to 67, I haven't got time to go through all of this, he talks about articles of faith of the new thinking, so new political principles. I mean, and none of them is completely new, but they recognize interconnection and interdependence, balance of interests, morals, universal values, respect for the individual, for human dignity. All this, he writes, must become an integral component of world politics and international relations, which is certainly true. And that involves, in another chapter, he talks about the need to democratize our international institutions, because if they're just run by the powerful for their own interests, and then again you have this crisis of trust and legitimacy. Then he goes on to look at who's who in the global world, starting with the US, and I've said a lot of what he said already. This tendency towards unilateralism and dominance. And also he quite rightly, and I heard him say this quite a number of years ago, he quite rightly criticizes the arrogance of the West and the US approach after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And so it was thought then, well, it just shows a triumph of the West, as opposed to thinking about what this represented for Russia, and trying to maintain a partnership approach rather than a domination approach. And of course, you can see how this has led, in inverted commas, to Putin and the way that Putin behaves. But he's also quite right. Putin, in his 2007 speech, which I read when I was reviewing another political book about 6 months ago, where he accuses the West of hypocrisy and double standards. And so to say that there's deception on one side and not on the other doesn't recognize this second state and policy implementation, in the case of the US, by the CIA, which has created very many regime changes in its time. As I discussed when I was looking at the book, latest book by David Ray Griffin, which includes a critique of American foreign policy. Then he looks at Europe, China, India, Middle East, Islam. There are a few kind of things he passes over, particularly in my view, with respect to China. And he also says that the real conflict, if you like, is between civilization or civility and barbarity, and how we cope with destabilization. Then towards the end, he goes on a bit more detail about the rollback of democracy and why this has occurred, and the fact that you can't impose democracy on societies that are not ready for it, and also that the US is more of an oligarchy, as many places are, because the politicians are paid by businesses for their campaigns, and so it's a rule of the powerful and the moneyed people rather than the rule of the people. And this has got out of hand more or less all the way around the world. So I'll finish by reading a couple of quotations towards the end here, because I see we're running up against time. I do not believe that the collapse of trust over recent years is irreversible. I view it as a lapse, a mistake. Fixing this mistake would take time and patience, common sense and negotiating skills. And above all, we must understand that we live together on this fragile planet, and we are all responsible for its future fate. And then the last paragraph of the book, which is in the afterword, he said that he believes that we can rise to perhaps our most arduous challenge, that of organizing the global world in a way that would enable all its peoples and individual denizens to live in safety and security, in judicious union with nature and in accordance with the demands of reason and morality. Hard to disagree with that. So that's a very powerful book by Mikhail Gorbachev, quite a short book, but making some extremely important points, and really recommending a much more cooperative way forward, one in which we listen properly to each other, respect each other, and seek to work together rather than dominate and eliminate. So, anybody like to make a comment about that? Just unmute yourself if you'd like to. Don't seem to be having any hands up.
No, my hand is up.
Oh yeah, good.
Okay.
Nice,
Hi, David. Everybody. So I'm struck by how eloquent people are about dealing with the issues, the problems that abounds. Eloquence, insight, inspiration. That we should really grasp our situation, but there's so little about what to do. To me, we talk about how to protect ourselves, but we don't talk about how to unite ourselves in the same degree of conversation and exploration and what have you. Things like, for instance, what if we brought everybody in the world up from poverty, kind of a universal basic income for everybody in the world? And I always quote Bucky Fuller from his last book, where he says that's possible. Please God, that is possible. But he says that, and why don't we think about that? Because if the whole world is full of people who are sustaining themselves, they won't have to war with each other to that degree. And then I know, David, you and I are talking about a universal meditation project for the whole world. Why don't we deal with these kind of things that would actually pull us together and make it a world where we can cooperate, rather than just being more eloquent about the difficulties that we face? Okay.
No, it's a very good point. And I suppose that each of us has to think about what's our sphere of influence and what's a point of entry And you're quite right that we have in mind an initiative of that kind, which could be, could make a contribution. But everything is so systemic and complex and interrelated that we need, a different vision of how to cooperate in the future, which this book actually provides, and then finding ways of effectively bringing that through governance systems, so that something actually happens, and things do in fact change. So it's getting a handle on it, and I suppose that we all have to decide what our role can be in this enormous shift that we all on this call think we need. And you doing your bit, I'm doing my bit, everybody else on the call is doing their little bit. So there isn't a simple, wave the magic wand solution.
Hey, actually, Dave, can I come in there?
Yes, sure, Patrick. And then
it's just that it's not simple, but it's actually simple. SIMPOL.
Ah, yes, no, I know. I've reviewed all these John Bunzel books.
Yes,
no, very good.
John is a good friend of mine, and I'm involved in that campaign, and we have been active for quite some years, and it's extraordinary in terms of actually how I suppose it's an incremental thing, but it has been very pragmatically effective on the ground in terms of kind of like pressurizing our politicians to. It's a way of citizens using their vote to actually say, okay, if you vote for simultaneous policy, which is effectively saying that in the world that we live in, globalization being globalization, is that it's happening beyond nation states. So our consciousness, as citizens is kind of still at the national level, and it needs to be at the global level. And that's where cooperation needs to happen. So the actually theory behind it is quite simple, if you like, in terms of getting that. But to put it into practice, we have this mechanism. And I've stuck it in the chat there, SIMP, simultaneous policy.
Yeah, well, I really recommend people have a look at this, because it's a way out of the prisoner's dilemma.
That's right.
Put it like that. It's a way of making sure that everybody acts at the same time, so nobody is disadvantaged by not acting, or put an advantage by not acting.
That's right.
Yes, and Suzanne's put in the chat her delight of the day, which I can highly recommend. That's just a small thing that arrives in your inbox, including music and art. And my wife and I, we were actually dancing to one of the recent things. They had a jazz selection from the 1950s, which is great. Or no, sorry, rock and roll. Jens, you have another point you'd like to make.
Yeah, so when we get to politics, we get to collective consciousness. And it seems to me that maybe SMN should reflect a little more on the relation between individual and collective consciousness. And your book number 2, actually, where you bring up this thick-skinned, thin-skinned people who are sensitive to emotions and so on. I mean, when we get to trust, we're getting to some kind of emotional attitudes, which can be on an individual level or can be on a more collective level. And I think maybe that's one point where we should try maybe to analyze or get more empirical data on the relation between individual and collective consciousness.
Yes, I mean, when I read Dark Night, Early Dawn 20 years ago, which was Chris Bache's book of the time, I realized that I'm both an individual and a collective being. We all are. And so one reflects the other. And I've become more aware of that. And there are, it's like the Global Consciousness Project, tries to measure some of these kind of fields of consciousness. And coming up on Monday, as nearly all of you will know, there's some major global meditations, which I'm certainly going to be taking part in. And I was looking out of the window this evening to see the gradual convergence of Saturn and Jupiter. And if you read about this, you'll know that it's the closest they've been since 1623, which is an awful long time ago. And it's said that this conjunction of renewal, because the dark then begins to recede, and the fact it's on the solstice, is a sort of sign of hope. But the hope that we can allow ourselves, does very much depend on coming together, as Margaret Mead suggested. That we need to have small groups of people, and they're the people who make a difference.
Can you say a little more about this thing on Monday?
Oh, Monday. Well, it's a global meditation which is being coordinated by various people, and I think the moment suggested is around the solstice itself, which is 6:22 CET. But I would just look it up, because there are various people who are doing various things. And in fact, on Monday at that time, Paul Fillmore will be doing his dialogue. And so I did actually suggest that you might think of putting something in about that, because we talked a few weeks ago about people wanting to celebrate the seasons and the turns of the year. So this is definitely your next one, just before Christmas, 21st of December, and the solstice, the darkest time, and the coming of the light.
Yeah.
Joan, thank you. Great. Excellent. Well, if there's no more questions, we're slightly on after time. And I've actually got
September really is so packed.
David, can I just put what I've said put into context?
Yeah, sure.
Someone coincidentally sent me this by Facebook. It is an astrologer, and I know people might have mixed feelings about astrology, but this is an astrologist just talking about next Monday and what's happening in the planets, etc. So I just thought people might be interested in it.
Very interesting. Thank you. I was on the community call, the Chartres Academy, on Sunday evening, and there was an astrologer on that as well. So I think the phrases that came to me for Humanity Rising were reconnect, renew, and regenerate. So the 3 R's. And I'm actually talking on a podcast with Eben Alexander and Karen Newell in less than an hour. Maybe see if I've got the link to that. I don't know. No. No, sorry, I haven't got the here we are. One Mind, United in Hope and Healing, it's called. Let me just put that into the chat. And then I'm on Buddha and the Gas Pump on Saturday, which you might have seen at the bottom of this briefing. So that's the one for this evening, if that's of any interest. I don't know what it's going to be about, but it'll be about hope and healing. So thank you all very much for attending. The next one will be in about a month. And in the meantime, I'm in the process of finishing the journal, but we won't be able to finalize all that until just into the new year, because the typesetter goes off on holiday on Monday. So they get quite a lot of time off. À la prochaine, as they say in France, and have a great Christmas, because I don't think Joan and I will see each other on Monday, but I don't think we'll see. We might. Tomorrow night's the bar, isn't it? We've got the bar tomorrow night, and Peter Fenwick's meditation. So probably see some of you there. So thanks so much, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Have a good Christmas, everyone.
Yeah, have a good Christmas.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Hi, Monica. Thank you.
Hi, good to see you.